What is going on, everybody? And welcome back into Bradley Studios. Now, today in the studio, we're going to be working on an awesome acrylic on canvas painting. This is a master touch canvas here, and it's a deep well canvas. I also have already painted the outside edges of this in a beautiful, rich ivory black. And I also will come out in the very last stages right before the actual varnishing process, and I will go ahead and touch that up just to kind of shape it up and make sure it's nice, crisp, and clean. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty of the actual painting itself and we really get into the actual process and have fun, just so you know, throughout the year, I will kind of send out reference photos of paintings that I may be interested to family members, like a group text. And I say, hey, look, is anybody interested in any of these forms of art for their homes? And if they are, then I'll kind of prioritize that item because I can create it real quick and give it to them. So my mother was the only one who was really interested in this or a pumpkin reference photo that I had sent out. I was like, all right, cool. Well, I thought I was going to have it done before fall of 2024. That did not happen. Of course, it's now December, almost near Christmas, and I really didn't lock down and really begin cracking down on this painting until like the beginning few weeks of December. So I've probably painted this whole process in about a week or so. And I really do take my time here in the studio. So if you're like, well, man, that video is really long, he took a lot of hours to paint something very simplistic. Well, it's not as simplistic as you may think. It's not just painting it and then just go. I'm applying a lot of layers to this and a lot of detail and a lot of depth, right? So she was the only one who was interested in it. And I was like, all right, so let's go ahead and get it done. Now, I want to go ahead and get this out of the studio so I can make room for some other art projects here on my canvas painting station. And I'm really excited for that. One of them will be a polar bear, as a spoiler alert. So stay tuned for that on the YouTube channel. I have a few other ones like different flowers and things like that coming out as well. So we're gonna get this done before Christmas, right? So I've already gone ahead and I've base coated it. We've already applied a little bit of a gold leaf background there, as you can see, and we also went ahead and kind of laid out the shadows of our pumpkins in a ultramarine blue. You don't really have to do that, but it does allow you to get in your mind's eye how the overall painting is going to lay out. I'm keeping things very dark overall, and I am working from dark to light, and then I'll work back into darks in the final stages. But most in general here, the focal point of this entire painting here, you would think it would be the orange pumpkin. No, it's not. It's actually this nice olive pumpkin down here. This pumpkin right here is the showpiece. It's the winning pig, right? So this is the one that we're focusing on. If you want to put like the best beats in front, put those money beats out front. Those are the money beats. Dwight Schrute reference if you don't know already. The Office. Okay, all right. So here we are with this beautiful olive pumpkin here, and I also gave it a little bit of a yellow tinge on those upper highlights where the light could be possibly cascading down. We're not adding light to this painting, but the simulated light would be coming in from this direction if we were to think of it that way. We come in with the orange mainly for this pumpkin here, and this one right here is mostly a yellow ochre. It's a yellow ochre pumpkin, and it's also darkened out, so it kind of sets itself back a little bit into this nice dark background here. Well, whether or not the background is something specific to you is up to the viewer, but you could think about this as like the edges of a forest, the upper sky of a darkening field, maybe at twilight. But ever so often as your light would hit this canvas in a hallway or in a living room, you'll see parts of this gold leaf shining through my paints and my overlays of paint and a few washes and inks. So we put a lot of gold leaf on there for texture, but then a lot of that texture gets kind of washed out, and then you only see that texture sometimes when you're up close, unless I go over it with a highlight, which we will do in its final stages. But this painting is reaching almost the end game stages here. I have a little bit more work to do on the upper highlights here, as well as maybe a little bit darkening right here. The darkness around the bottom of the pumpkins here, I'm really happy with. I love how I have this right here, and this has a little bit of a different texture than the smooth texture on the bottom of this pumpkin. And then over here you see there's a little bit of splotching where you can see I use that palette knife. So we'll pull out the palette knife. And then I have this nice kind of like just swiped horizontal effect with the paintbrush here at the very bottom with a little bit of Naples yellow, but it also has a little bit of gold leaf in there. So we're going to be very detailed not to cover that up. We're going to come in here in a minute and we're going to go ahead and apply some more of these rich red colors to this kind of like, I want to make it a flattened kind of field leaf effect. And then we may apply a few sprigs of like a dried, perhaps straw or something like that down here at the very bottom before we kind of finish out some like major, massive highlights here. I do believe I'm going to apply just a very thick, like palette knife swipe to each individual highlighted upper raised rib of each individual pumpkin. But I'm really happy with how it turns out so far. Let's go ahead and get through the painting process. All right, you guys, so let's go ahead and jump into the voiceover here. Now let's get started. Now, as you can see, we did go ahead and give it that ultramarine blue shadow underlay. It's not really necessary, and I stated that before earlier in this content, but just be aware you don't have to do that. You could also just sketch it in with charcoal or graphite, and then you can just kind of build up your layers from there if you'd like to do it that way also. I do that method for a lot of the paintings that I create. But it honestly just depends on how I would like to kick off a new piece of artwork here in the studio, which option I'd go with. We also went ahead and gave it a gold leaf kind of background overlay. Now, I use that a lot of times here recently in a lot of my art forms because I want to kind of build up a lot of texture without just always having to use gesso or acrylic paints to build up those layers. So what I'll do is I'll use that the either gold leaf, silver leaf, or a bronze leaf to kind of build up a very nice background or over some of the ribs of the pumpkins in this situation. And a lot of that will get kind of covered up throughout the process. But if you wanted some of that to be visible, like I do have some of that gold leaf visible at the very end stages of this painting, I can go over that with inks and things like that to kind of make sure that that gold leaf is still visible in some ways. You can also use it to kind of have a play on the light source that you may have coming in on the painting from a hallway or something like that. I've mentioned it in previous painting content videos that if you use a cool light or a warm light, when it hits the silver or the gold leaf, it can present in different ways. So it really does kind of change how the light is hitting the canvas. You could also use the gold leaf to really kind of bring in a light source without just having specifically painted in. You could use the gold leaf to complement where the light source is coming from and cascading down onto the actual reference items that you're painting. Now this is kind of like a still life in a way, but we're being very free with it. We're using a lot of methods as far as brushwork, palette knife, gold leaf, and things like that. So I like to go through a lot of stages throughout the creation process, and I want to make sure that this painting for my mother is extremely deep and vibrant as far as the browns and the fall kind of foliage colors that we're going to be using. So right now we're just kind of laying in the general first coat of paint. I'm just kind of blocking it in. Now the original ultramarine shadows that we applied will kind of get washed out throughout the process. And that is completely okay. I fully expect that. Just like some of the gold leaf will get covered up, that's part of the process and part of the enjoyment of the creation. Now, if I do paint any of these more so in other originals, then of course each one is slightly different than the one before, so they're never ever the same overall brush stroke. And that's what you get with all the paintings that you create just from originals instead of just selling prints all the time. Now, throughout this process, you will notate a few things. I will notate the timestamps, or more so the session number at the top of each transition into the next session. I did paint this probably overall in about a week or so. Maybe a little bit more than that, maybe 15, 20 minutes once in a while at night. Some of the sessions ran about maybe 30, 40 minutes long, depending on how long the dry time is and what I'm doing with the process. I could apply a wash and then wait for it to dry, hit it with the heat gun, and then I apply the next layer of paint all in one night. But overall, it's a very laid-back painting. I wasn't rushed in a lot of ways. but I was unable to get this out for Thanksgiving or Halloween or fall season for my mother. So I wanted to try to get it done before the Christmas season, rolling into 2025, so we can make a lot of other forms of art here in the studio, and I don't have this painting kind of sitting in my station. I know I mentioned that earlier in the intro, but I just kind of want to mention it again. That's the mindset that I'm going into this is that I want to kind of portray those session numbers, so that way you can kind of get a realistic portrayal of how long it takes to do some of these stages if you're following along that detailed with the process. Now, I was unhappy with this little mediocre rinky-dink pumpkin in the very front. It was just tiny. It was just minuscule. Now, at this point, I'm really starting to think about how I would like for the viewer to really be viewing these pumpkins. And I was wanting to create like a light green / speckled dark green pumpkin. I might make that again in the future with the next pumpkin painting that I make. It'll probably be another year or so before I make another one, because I have such a long list of things to make. But I was really playing with that idea, but I decided to kind of go with just solid colored pumpkins for this painting, and instead of making a lot textured actually on the outside of the pumpkin. Now, I'm working with the palette knife at this point, and I'm working with the long blade palette knife, and I'll kind of transition down into the smaller one here in a little while, just to get a lot more control over where I lay that thick paint. I really want to lay a lot of thick paint in this overall painting, the same way that I laid it into the American bald eagle, or the brown eagle that I had created it was a panel board. You can also find that on my YouTube channel, and I will just kind of link the overall general painting playlist at the very end of the video. Or you can also check out the micro clip of this actual content. So if you want to see me do this painting in an extreme time lapse, then you can do so. I will also shrink that down in just a really nice, easy, bite-sized, maybe 10 or 20 minute long video. So I'm using that paint. I'm really just kind of thinking about how I want the overall kind of like layers to be, kind of what direction I'd like for them to be. I'm also layering in things into the background, kind of starting to build up the colors on that background that I would like. I want it to be kind of like, I imagine it being like a nice fall harvest sky, and I don't want it to be very blue and very open. I want it to be kind of like overcast, dark and brown, dinged out, and I want it to look like maybe there's like little pieces of that sun might be like passing through like a dark over cloud, or a fall evening or sunset. You don't specifically see that sun, but you can kind of get hints that there may be a sun behind that overcast of a fall cool day at the pumpkin patch, as it were. So now I'm really kind of using the palette knife. I'm using a raw yellow ochre here. This is a Winsor & Newton. All of these are Winsor & Newton paints, so just be aware of that moving forward. But I'm being very deliberate to make sure that I leave very thick layers of paint behind. We've already done a little bit of the underpainting. At this point, I'm really starting to try to build up the texture that I'll start to build up the washes and details on top of these thick layers. I'm really mushing the palette knife in. I want to make sure I push it so that I create a nice lip type of effect over each kind of like palette stroke. So just make sure that when you're doing something like this, if you're going for that thick look, just embrace it and run with it, and let the palette knife do the work. All you have to do is just to apply the pressure and then just push it in the direction you want. I really have fallen in love with using the palette knife, and I really wasn't using the palette knife in my earlier paintings, and I feel like I was missing out on that. I've came a long way since I've made some of those original first paintings. But I'm really happy with the palette knife work specifically on this painting. It's turned out really great. I'm switching up to the fan brush here. I decided to go ahead and start using the fan brush on the background because I really wanted to create just a kind of a speckled, lot of texture background. And the fan brush is just sometimes the easiest way to kind of blend this in. And I want to make sure that it's not uniform in any way. We want a lot of texture, a lot of breaks in the color. So again, I really just wanted the viewer to be able to look at the background and them in their own mind's eye decide what they would like to imagine to be. Is it the sky on a nice fall day? Is it the shrubbery in the background that you see? Maybe it's the pumpkins are at the end of like a dried fall forest. Maybe this is just the tall grass or brush around the pumpkins in the field, and they were freshly cut. It's up to the viewer to decide how or what they see in the background. And all we're going to do is just give it a lot of richness and a lot of depth. And that's why we use the overall layers, gold leaf, and the washes that we use. Because when you apply additional washes to it, it really intensifies those existing kind of warm, nice background colors. And when we get to those stages of the wash, even over the pumpkins, it darkens everything out. And then you can come in with lighter colors on top of that, and you have those really deep, gorgeous colors underneath. So when you get up on the painting and you start to look really in depth at it, it's just absolutely deep. We're using a little bit of the sponge action here just to kind of blend in some of these edges here. I'll also use that to also create hard edges on the background. And I do come back later on down the road at the very end processes, and I will change a little bit of the color of the background under that large orange pumpkin. It turned out a little bit darker than I'd like to see because I want to make sure that that stem is visible. And throughout the process, that background got too dark underneath that. So we'll tinker with that later on in the process. But as of right now, I'm really happy with how that's turning out. Session number 6 here, we're going with an acrylic ink wash. This is a Daler and Rowney ink. And we're going to go ahead and thin this out quite a bit. Now I'm using a burnt umber here. And we're going to go ahead and roll this over the entire painting. I'm not afraid of drips at this point. We've still got a lot of painting to do throughout the process to finalize this painting. Now you can kind of see I'm being very selective of where I apply this color. And even over the gold leaf on the left-hand side of the canvas, as well as the upper right-hand side, you can really see that the gold leaf is intensified and deepened by that brown. So it's very transparent in a lot of ways, but it adds a lot of kind of film and depth to those colors. Just kind of nitpicking here over it. I'm using just a watered down version. I'm warming that up so it dries extremely fast. Again, it's mostly water, so there's not much actual like inks or like it's not much. There's no alcohol in it to dissolve the under layers of paint or anything like that. I did not use any alcohol inks in this painting. It's all just acrylic washes. Going over it with just a little bit of a fine tip brush there. It didn't matter the size at all, just because we're just kind of keeping things very nice and free. But I am trying to darken a little bit of those upper edges of the background there, just so that it kind of brings a little bit more focus to where it's lighter there towards the back of the pumpkins there. That's possibly where we could potentially have the light kind of coming into the image or the still life here. So you can see I'm applying a lot of darkness there. This is actually just a pure Winsor & Newton burnt umber. So we've kind of switched off the acrylics and we're working with actual acrylic paints now. Then we are just applying a little bit of separation there between the colors so it doesn't look like it's just all completely blended there. I want to make sure it has a lot of texture between some of those colored layers. So here I am working around the stem of one of the pumpkins here. This is the one we'll come back to a little bit later. But I am kind of making sure that I get some of those colors kind of like up to the edge of where I would want the edge of the pumpkin to be. Just because I won't have to come back and detail that later too much. When I bring the edges of the pumpkins out a little bit to kind of create a little bit of depth and shape on the pumpkin edge itself, I just want to make sure that it's kind of like overlaying that background so that it's not like a hard edge up against the pumpkin. It needs to have a little bit of a soft tapered edge to where it's kind of behind the pumpkin, as it were, quotation marks, behind the pumpkin. and we want to make sure that it looks really good, and that there's no such a hard line on the edge of that where it draws the eye away from the pumpkins. Here in a little bit, I'll kind of reference and talk about where I want the focal eye to be for the painting, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Session number 6 here, guys, we're going to be working with a spray and a blend. Now, we've already let the inks dry for just a few minutes here as I worked with the paintbrush to kind of apply a little bit of that burnt umber. I went ahead and completely soaked the entire canvas here, and we're using a nice, beautiful, soft blending brush. And we're just going to blend out any of those remaining still activated inks and kind of blend them out a little bit. I really love the overall texture of the background. I like that I applied a little bit of striation, like swipe down effect right there towards the very top of the canvas. I really think it draws the eye and it looks really cool. So you can see some of those thicker paints there around the outside ribs of the pumpkin. And at this point, we're going to start to apply mid layers in session number 7. Now we're going to go ahead and use just a medium-sized filbert brush for this. I don't use a whole lot of small paint brushes throughout this process unless I'm just trying to do some highlights at the very end. But we'll get to that later. So I'm just using just a handful of browns here. Raw umber, burnt umber, raw sienna. And we're just going to kind of keep it very earthy. A lot of these are just pure colors at this point, and I haven't started doing a whole lot of mixing on the browns of the stems quite yet. But mostly I'm just applying just with the filbert brush very thick lines, giving it a lot of directional texture in the way that I want the overall stem or slash bark-like effect to look. Making sure to get the top edges of the pumpkin. I kind of really didn't block those in when I first painted it or sketched them in until this point, right? I kind of lightly sketched them in. We threw that ultramarine blue background on it, kind of got the shadows where we think we would like it. But I really don't decide how I want the overall shape of the pumpkin to be until I get to the later stages like this of the painting process for the pumpkins, because I would like for, even in the future, if I remake this for a customer or a commission piece, I want to make sure that each one is a little bit unique in its own way. And so these are very free, and I kind of just use the paint to tell me how I'd like for that pumpkin to look. Now just remember, at this point I am still using yellow ochre on this pumpkin on the left hand side, and at this point I honestly thought that I was going to go ahead and kind of bleach it out and create a just nice kind of like a nice dinged out dirty white pumpkin, maybe like an off-white, but just enough to where it kind of really just popped against the wall. But as I worked through some of the processes in the middle of this content video, I really decided I want to kind of keep this yellow ochre color intact for this pumpkin, and I really just fell in love with the color. It was very rich and almost like a golden kind of color, and I just think that it screamed fall, like earthy, and I liked it. So although I'll come in detail and paint it, this pumpkin is going to be a yellow ochre pumpkin. Now the yellow ochre pumpkin is not the centerpiece of this painting, but it will draw the eye a little bit. So right now what I'm doing is I'm building up those yellow ochre layers around the ribs of the pumpkin. But I'm trying not to blend out all of that beautiful, like a rich burnt umber that I had applied to the actual shadows of the ribs of the pumpkin. So we're kind of blending that in here and there. I'm really trying to think about where I'd like for that glare or the shiny spots or the highlights to be on the upper raised parts of the pumpkin ribs. So I'm just kind of like bringing the browns in, bringing the yellow ochre in, deciding how I'd like for those to be shadowed in shape, while just really keeping it very loose and just free. So what I'm trying to do now and throughout this process is I'll slowly add in a little bit of darkness just to where the ribs come up to the top crown of the pumpkin, and then it divots into where the stem is attached to the actual like fruit or the pumpkin itself. I want to make sure that I just dinge that out in nice rich brown so it creates a lot of shadow there. And I'll kind of like just do that slowly throughout the process until I build up the overall kind of rich shadow that I would like around the bottom or the end of the stem for each pumpkin individually. And depending on how the stem is attached to the pumpkin, really depends on what kind of like and how much brown shadows I add to the crown of the pumpkin. Alright, so at this point I need to let the mid layers of the yellow ochre pumpkin rest. So I decided to go ahead and shift down to my olive pumpkin. Now this is a absolute beautiful color, guys. And I'm not a gatekeeper, but man, this color, if I could choose one color, maybe one or two colors that I just kept in my arsenal that I never gave to anybody else, it might be this pale olive from Winsor & Newton. Props to Winsor & Newton. I love this beautiful, nice color. Maybe I can do like an Easter painting here coming up with this color and make it like the show, the piece of the show that really shines. Now, again, remember I originally thought that I was going to kind of do like just a pale olive pumpkin with a lot of splotching, a lot of texture, make it really bumpy and ripply. Those kind of pumpkins are really getting popular again. Those old-fashioned, like really like kind of Frankenstein looking pumpkins, but I decided to kind of keep it smooth, and we're just gonna kind of run with it, and we're just gonna kind of make it where the pumpkins look like they're blended in the same overall kind of texture and style. So what I'm doing now here, although I had used the overall paint palette knife to apply a lot of thick layers and lines to this, some of those lines will come back in later in the processes, and we'll highlight it and use those as accents to the shadows. But right now what I'm doing is I'm just building up a lot of thick paint, and I'll do this first pass, and then I'll let it dry for maybe a few minutes, and then I'll really cake the paint onto the brush and we'll apply a thicker layer. I did hopscotch jump there in the video content. I did apply a little bit of brown shadows to that. And then we're going to go ahead and continue building up on those olive highlight raised edges of the ribs throughout the overall painting process. So here in a moment, just like we did for the yellow ochre, we'll let this pumpkin rest, and then we'll move on to the next one, and then we'll probably move into another session there. But as you can see, we got a lot of shadow around the bottom edge of that olive pumpkin. And if you haven't realized already, guys, spoiler alert, this olive pumpkin is going to be the center eye of this painting. So my hope is that when you look at the overall painting in total, because the yellow ochre and the orange pumpkin are a little bit darker and dinged out, very dirty, set back just slightly, even though they are larger, this pale olive pumpkin will really draw your eye downward to say kind of like the center of the painting or the canvas itself, and then your eyes will probably wander up again, or at least that's my hope. You can make a piece of painting or art and you just assume sometimes that it's going to kind of like go into people's eyes and minds the right way. But each person is different, and they may see your art differently as well. Now, this was technically the end of the night. I was tired. It was just time for bed. I do have a full-time job, and art is not my full-time career, guys. So I had a little bit of orange left on my palette, and I decided just to grab my palette knife and just scrape that onto the pumpkin and just apply a little bit of paint there. I just don't want to waste that paint, and because it is also a part palette knife, I want to make sure that kind of don't waste that paint. Session number 8, palette knife and shadows. Very cool. So we're going to go ahead and start to use a little bit of burnt umber as well as some raw sienna, and we're going to start to apply a lot of texture to our stems. We have a lot of texture in the pumpkin ribs themselves, but we want to make sure that the actual stems have a very cool texture as well, so that they feel like they're not flat when the rest of it just has a lot of dimension. So we're going to go ahead and bring in a lot of browns and a lot of dark colors. I'll start to also introduce a little bit of Mars Black into, say, like a little bit of Van Dyke Brown, or even just raw umber will be fine. And we're just going to go ahead and start to apply a lot of shadows with the palette knife. And the palette knife keeps you very loose and free with these shadows. Even if you decide to come in later with a paintbrush and blend some of that out, you want it to be free. And nature is wild, and although you may not have meant to put that palette knife stroke there, nature does what it wants to do sometimes. And especially when you're like painting a still life just from your head, not referencing something specific and having to make it super realistic, then you can kind of just be really free with it. Using some of that brown there to kind of give a little bit of shadow of the top parts of the pale olive pumpkin here, shadowing the lower portion of that pumpkin to make it look like it's rolled towards us, and that has a shadow underlay. Also, same thing with the yellow ochre pumpkin. We're going to continuously darken out the bottom of that pumpkin quite a bit, as well as where it's recessed possibly behind the pale olive pumpkin, and then also the orange pumpkin. So we'll start to kind of blend that out. Now at this point we still haven't put the mid layers into the actual orange pumpkin, and we're going to get to that shortly. But I was just really caught up in my own mind on working on this yellow ochre pumpkin and the pale olive, and I was inside my own head in some of these sessions, and sometimes my paintbrush just moves across the canvas in wild ways, and I jump around a lot. I know there are a lot of artists who like really just paint from, like, do one section at a time, paint all of the layers and then move on to the next section. I really just haven't found myself to be that way. I like to kind of focus on just move around the canvas and just let the paint speak to me. That sounds kind of cheesy, but that's a realistic thing. So there's some music playing in the background as I'm painting these sessions, and I'm just really just letting the paintbrush work do what I just feel like it should do. And I'm not locking myself into any one specific design, or I have to do it this way. If I don't do it this way, it's not going to be right. And I just don't want to be that way. So session number 9, mid layers on the orange pumpkin. Super exciting here. Let's get some orange on this canvas. Now we are using a cadmium orange for our paint here. This is a Winsor & Newton cadmium orange, and we will also start to, at one point throughout the process, begin to introduce cadmium yellow into that orange just to kind of brighten it a little bit. And then we'll also come in with our browns again to kind of give the shadows of the ribs a lot more intensity and depth. We are also going to be introducing a little bit of crimson as well as alizarin crimson into our oranges to give it a nice, deep, rich is the word, kind of red to orange color tone. Now you'll see I'll go back and forth between the red rich and the yellow and orange, but it depends on how I would like for those layers to look as I build up the ribs of this pumpkin here. This pumpkin at its earlier stages was a little bit of love-hate, but trust the process, and it started to turn out pretty good, and I was happy by the end of the painting. I didn't go outside and set it on fire, I promise. Alright, so as you can see, the pumpkin is absolutely getting red here. Now, this is really cool. I really like the richness of this, and don't stress yourselves, guys. It's not going to be a red pumpkin, but just give it a little bit of time, and we're going to start covering some of these layers up with our oranges again, and it's going to create a lot of depth in those ribs of the pumpkin. Now, don't cover it all up. You don't want to do that, but it's going to allow a lot of deepness in the shadows as well as the texture of those ribs of the pumpkin. Coming in with a little bit of those browns there, we're going to go ahead and continuously shadow in the bottom of the pumpkins here. And it's not like you can't come in with one of those colors, the orange or the yellow ochre or the pale olive, and kind of fine tune that later on in the process if you want to do a little bit of a dry brush over some of those shadows. But we're just kind of building up colors. Coming in with more of that brown there, and I'm mixing the brown with the cadmium orange just to kind of keep the overall color hue in the orange category there. It's okay to give it a little bit of brown there, but we want to make sure that the orange pumpkin is orange. Now at this point, guys, if you've made it this far into this amazing painting here, make sure you hit the like and the subscribe so you can check out all the other forms of art that I have coming out or have already created here on my YouTube channel. Alright guys, so we're just a little bit halfway through this full length painting process here, guys, at 39 minutes on the timestamp. Now, if you would like to, I highly recommend you like and subscribe to my channel here. I'm always coming out with new content here. I just actually passed the 500 pieces of content uploaded to YouTube milestone, so that is super exciting. If you would like your own form of art from me, whether it's a commission or something that I've already created in the past, you can always check me out on Etsy at John Byerly Art Studio. Reach out to me, message me if you want, whether it's a diorama, a tumbler, a canvas painting, oils, watercolors, anything you want. Just reach out to me and we'll kind of touch base. If you would like prints of my artwork, masterfully made or free shipping and shipped to you, make sure you check out my pictorum.com profile. I will link that in the description below. But otherwise, guys, I hope you are enjoying the content so far. Sit back, let's get into the second half of this amazing painting process. All right, so we're coming up to the end of this session, and it is time for bed, right? We are going to roll into session number 10, brighter light tone layers. So I'm going to start to introduce a little bit of Naples yellow in all of my layers here, and we're going to start to use that. I really have been going out of my way to avoid titanium white. Not that I don't use titanium white, but I just feel like titanium white, in some ways, it just dominates the painting way too much. And I just feel like it's just too bright. It's too much. So I have been starting to change things up a bit. Now if I make like a pop art style piece of art, obviously I'll be using titanium white for whatever reason. whether it's just a solid white background or some mixing some colors just to kind of like pale them out a little bit. But when it comes to something like this, where everything's very earthy, field light, why would I need a lot of titanium white in this? Why not just use a nice, beautiful, rich, earthy color like Naples yellow? Yeah, so Naples yellow is the white that we're using throughout this entire process, and that's what we're going to be leaning on. So right now what I'm doing is I'm still applying very, very thick layers, being very loose in my brush strokes on the stem of the pumpkin, but we're going over all those dark colors with lighter colors now. So we're going over those burnt umbers and raw umbers, and a little bit of that Marsh black base coat on the stems with more so the Naples yellow, a little bit of that yellow, same yellow ochre, things like that. So you'll really start to see those stems start to pop as we apply more of these layers to those stems coming up and away from the pumpkins. I'm also being very deliberate, you guys, not to paint the stems the same way. They all are their own format, their own direction. They don't need to be uniform. Don't make it cartoonish. Make it very free flowing. Okay, let it be open. Let it look natural. Don't make them the same. Don't lock yourself into painting it the exact same way over and over. Don't make them the same direction, not the same shape. All these pumpkins are different sizes. They could be attached to stems in different ways, all sorts of things. Applying a little bit of the shadow to the bottom of the stem there, just because the light source could potentially be coming from like above to the center back of the canvas there. So we're going to go ahead and make sure that we apply a little bit of shadow to the stems as well. Continuously coming back and darkening in the crown of the pumpkin, and that's going to kind of come a long way throughout the later processes of this second half of the video content. Is the shadows will have a long way to go. It's going to be really good. Now, one thing that you'll notice is this is probably one of the longest painting sessions that I have in this content. The one after this, I think it's almost the last session, is also very long because I was really pushing myself to try to get it done before the Christmas season. That way I could gift it to my mother. We're going to go ahead and come in here and apply another layer to the actual stem of the pumpkin itself, the olive pumpkin. And of course, this stem is a little bit sharper. It's a very more so jagged, and it's almost as if it's almost pointed towards the viewer a little bit. It doesn't look as like flat. It just looks like it's a little bit of different dimension, and the pumpkin is facing a different way. And I like the fact that because the stem is facing up and like towards the viewer at a little bit of an angle, it makes it look like that olive pumpkin is truly just leaning up against these other two large-scale pumpkins. I think it just looks really cool. It's the small details sometimes that just really look great. Now, what I'm doing now with the pale olive pumpkin is that I'm starting to introduce lighter colors to the high raised edges of the ribs of the pumpkin. Now, I'm introducing a little bit of cadmium yellow in with the same pale olive, and that's giving us those raised like kind of highlights over the ribs of the pumpkin. I'm going to be very detailed about where I apply this because it's pretty powerful, and I don't want it to diminish or kind of like wipe away, erode, destroy the shadows that I have created so far. Alrighty, so at this point, I'm really happy with how the little pumpkin's turning out. He's looking really good. But I need to go ahead and let it rest, see how I feel about it the next day or so. And we're going to go ahead and apply another layer to the orange pumpkin here. I'm going to start to lighten it up quite a bit to create just a lot of light that's coming down on top of this orange pumpkin. So we're using a little bit of that Naples yellow, as well as the cadmium yellow and the existing cadmium orange. The cadmium orange is just a little bit transparent in a little bit of ways because it is a thinner paint, but it's really great. I'm really happy with how we're able to build up some of the colors and layers over these undertone darker layers. So it's going to turn out really good. So go ahead and sit back as we go ahead and apply these lighter colors over the tops of the pumpkins. I did have to wipe some off there because I was just unhappy with how it was like laying on the canvas. I probably just applied too much water to my brush there, and I just had to do some work to fix it up. I went ahead and grabbed me a long handle brush there just so I could be a lot looser with it and a lot more free with the paint strokes as I kind of bring those paint strokes down and around the edges of the ribs of the pumpkins. All right, so at this point, I'm really happy with how the kind of lighter colors are looking on the pumpkin. And I was very tempted to go ahead and start to apply some highlights to some of the texture that we've left behind with the palette knife. Sometimes I'll come in, I'll apply like lighter colors of like final highlights to some of those raised edges of the palette knife ridges and lines. I had to rein myself in. Not yet, John. Not yet. I'm super excited at this point in the painting. I'm really happy with how it's turning out. But I had to rein myself in. So I'm going to apply a little bit of shadow to the stem and the crown of that pumpkin. And then we're going to go ahead and shift over to our yellow ochre pumpkin. As you can see at this point in time, the yellow ochre pumpkin is really recessed as far in the back because how dark it is in comparison to these other two lighter color pumpkins that we've really brought forward into the overall, kind of like the mind's eye of the painting, right? So we're gonna go ahead and mix up our Naples yellow as well as the yellow ochre for a nice very nice light color of the existing yellow ochre that we already have. All we're doing is we're brightening it up a little bit, and we're going to use that to go over some of the higher edges of the ribs of the yellow ochre pumpkin, just to build up some of those highlights and just the raised edges of the ribs themselves. I'm going to start to lean in more towards the Naples yellow as I start to mix out more of this color, and I'm going to continuously apply that to the upper raised edges of the actual ribs themselves. You can see it's getting a lot brighter in color compared to the existing just straight up yellow ochre that we used on the original base coat. So it's really bringing that up a little bit. It's making it a little bit larger, a little bit more vibrant, and more alive. All right, so at this point, I'm really happy with how the highlights are on the yellow ochre pumpkin here, but I'm gonna go ahead and just brighten it up. And originally I was thinking about just giving it some extremely bright highlights and then just dinging them out later with some like washes when I come in to ground this all out and just give it a lot of depth. But it really just didn't feel right to me, and I'll kind of show you why. So I'm using the paintbrush here, using a lot of that Naples yellow there, applying a lot of the kind of like downward, nice curved pieces to the ribs, being very deliberate in the outside line of those, so it has a very hard line, so it actually looks like an item on, when you look at it opposed to the background, as it were. And we're kind of bring this down, and I'm really thinking about how I would like for the sunlight or whatever it is to be coming down and hitting the tops of these ribs, and where I'd like for them just to have a little bit more vibrancy and life and light to them. So at this point, I'm just kind of layering in using that very long bristle brush so we can go ahead and get that laid in there. Alrighty, so the end of that session, and we're moving on to session number 10, and we're going to be working on the foreground and some higher highlights here. higher highlights aren't very much. It's just a small section here, but we are going to be working on the foreground here. And originally I was thinking about maybe I can make a packed down like leaf effect, or maybe I can make it to where like there's like foliage leaves kind of like halfway or a quarter way of the pumpkin, or maybe I can make a straw base and dirt. Maybe the pumpkins are sitting some straw in the middle of the field. I decided to go with this smushed fresh leaf look. And not only is this going to apply a lot of like just color, rich, beautiful colors of the actual base, but it's going to look freaking amazing, guys. So what we're going to do here is we're not going to kind of like paint any specific shape of leaves. We're going to kind of create this symbolic, flattened down dirt earth effect. It's going to allow us to keep it very loose, or very easy, very simplistic overall. So I'll come in with a lot of alizarin crimson, yellow ochre, raw sienna, a little bit of crimson, alizarin crimson, cadmium yellow, and cadmium orange, and we can kind of layer these in very thin, generally thin lines under the actual pumpkins themselves, and then we'll kind of dinge those out with some burnt umber and washes, just to kind of blend them into the existing base coat or background of the pumpkin. So right now I'm just coming in here, guys. I'm applying a little bit of greenery to it, not much, just enough to be dangerous, right? Just a little bit of greenery and sprigs of grass, just to give it a little bit of variations in color for the foreground itself. Looking pretty good overall, right, guys? So I like that it's bringing a lot of colors into the actual bottom of the painting, and because there's such rich, deep colors, it just looks really good in contrast to the darker overall tone of the pumpkins themselves. I really didn't need to put any kind of like little spurts of grass in here, but I decided to anyways. I really just thought they added just like a little pop of greenery to it.
just enough to kind of really just give it a lot of whimsical, like a little bit of beauty there. Instead of everything being such fall tones and colors through the whole painting, we're just going to give it a little spruce, little patches of some, whether it's like mossy texture hidden in the leaves, or potentially like grass that's laid over under the edge of the pumpkin. Little spurts of grass that are kind of just, because the pumpkins have been growing there for a while, maybe the grass is kind of sparse and patchy, and it's kind of growing through the edges of the leaves, and the weed eater or the mower or whatever can't get to them. So I just thought it was just small little details to add a little bit of extra color to the overall canvas itself. Think big picture, not just what we're working on at the little like piece that we are at the time. Now you'll also notate that I am also using the palette knife here, and I'm mainly just kind of just being very free and slapping the paint on here and there, pulling it in particular directions, and just being very free with how I would like for that to be layered on. I'm also using the palette knife to kind of like brush on those little grass spurts there, as well as just a little bit of greenery in the actual leaves themselves to simulate those laid over grass or mossy effects. Putting a little bit of greenery around the edge of the bottom of the olive pumpkin there. I think it can contrast very good against the pale olive that we have on the pumpkin itself. And of course, like I said, we're going to dim this out in just a few moments. So here we are, we're using that brown wash here, the same brown wash we used earlier in the overall process. And this is going to be a burnt umber and a sepia mix. The sepia really darkens it out quite a bit, and I'll also kind of bring this up on the bottoms of the pumpkins just a little bit to create a little bit of shadow on the bottom of each individual pumpkin, even apart from just applying it to the leaves at the bottom of the painting itself. We will let this completely dry, and I will give it a few just raised little bright highlights to some particular leaves at the very bottom, like a little bit of pure crimson or pure cadmium orange or something very simplistic. But it's just small things in the larger scale and just little highlights to the actual leaf patch at the bottom, because not all of them would be completely densed out. You would have some that are a little bit fresher or sticking up out of that overall undergrowth or leaf growth, leaf pack down area, however you want to say it. And those would be potentially drier or more vibrant than the earth mixed leaves that are kind of decaying or flattened down or really wet and cakey. So we're going to make sure it has a little bit of vibrancy there, but not just so much that it just completely takes over. Subtlety, but beauty, right? Okay. Makes sense. Or at least it does in my head. Alright, so at this stage in the process, I'm really kind of getting down to the very nitty gritty. I'm waiting for that foreground to kind of dry out there, and I actually just do a little bit of highlights off the camera, but it's just pure solid colors, right? As I spoke of just a second ago. But we're going over these raised palette knife and gold leaf textures that were left behind throughout the entire painting process with a little bit of not titanium white, Naples yellow. It's a very light, warm color, and it's going to look really good. The titanium white, as I spoke of earlier, would be too dominating, and we're doing a very much a dry brush effect over some of these raised edges. It's just going to be small little accents. Pumpkins have a lot of dirt, a lot of texture, a lot of defects. A lot of times, you could have like a little bit of a mossy texture on them, or whatever you want to call them, like some type of like organic buildup. And we're going to go ahead and use all of those textures that we had created throughout the entire process just to bring some of those little details forward and add a lot of dimension to the overall canvas piece itself. It's not really necessary, but I find that it just intensifies the overall look of the canvas, and it really does bring it alive to another level, right? Another layer, another level of artistry. And we're just utilizing what we had already had on the canvas as it is, And because we're just following these existing raised edges, it kind of reins you in and makes it to where you don't like lose control over some of these layers. Now what you'll notice here is some of these raised edges, instead of using just the Naples yellow, I'll actually use just a tiny bit of Naples yellow in the original pumpkin color, like, you know, pale olive, cadmium orange, or yellow ochre, and I'll use that to add the highlights to the pumpkin with those raised edges of the palette knife. So it just depends on how I feel with each individual piece, whether or not it needs an ultra bright highlight or if it needs a color that's kind of blended in a little bit more to the existing pumpkin color that we've already applied. Kind of adding a little bit of definition around that corner there, but otherwise it's looking really good, you guys. Defining that edge around the right hand side where the yellow pumpkin is, because it was the last mid layers that had painted on there. They kind of cascaded onto the pale olive a little bit. We want to make sure that that's not happening, because that would just look out of place. Why would orange on the back side be cascading onto the front side of that pumpkin, which is in the foreground? That makes no sense. Applying a little bit of yellow, Naples yellow, and a little bit of titanium white to some raw sienna here, and I'm going to apply some just highlights to the actual stems themselves, just to bring a little bit more highlights to those as well. It's just small, but it's just little things that add up in the last few stages of the overall painting. Now, you always know that we're kind of reaching the end of the painting process when I'm going down into a micro brush for little sprigs of yellow on some of these high little sprigs of grass. Just little small things that add a little bit of color and pop to the actual foreground. Just a little bit. It's not much at all, so don't overthink that. But it looks really good overall. Applying a little bit of dark, this is almost just pure raw umber or burnt umber to the shadows where the pumpkin's kind of rolling over into the leaves. You'd have a little bit of shadow there, making sure that's deep enough, and I'm happy with that. I actually sat down for a while and just looked at the painting by itself, not touched for a day or so, to see if I liked how the overall thing looked. And I just felt like it needed a little bit darker shadow underneath the edge of the pumpkin where the foreground is right here. Looking pretty good. Now I do have the painting hanging up, and this is before the varnishing process, and it will get a Winsor & Newton can spray gloss varnish before it is ready to be gifted to my mother. Now later on down the road, I will come back in and add like a charcoal sketch to the back, which I do try to challenge myself in for all of the paintings that I create. So I'll probably come back and do that later. That doesn't keep me from being able to give this to her for Christmas of 2024. If you would like a print of this, make sure you check out Pictorum.com. Looking pretty good, isn't it? See that texture for the palette knife left behind? Absolutely outstanding, you guys. All right, you guys, so here is this awesome pumpkin trio painting. Now, it turned out absolutely awesome. It probably took me about a week or so, about 11 sessions, you know, those sessions running maybe even anything from 10 minutes to 30-minute long sessions to create this awesome painting here. Now, it is, of course, pumpkin trio because we do have 3 pumpkins in this awesome little painting here. We also have a really great texture background, and it has also gold leaf inlaid in the overall painting. A lot of that's covered up, and it creates like a nice thick textured layer throughout the whole process. We also, again, used the palette knife to create this awesome little painting here. And we also made the distinct leaf, pat down leaf effect in the foreground. I have given this a clear coat or a varnishing layer. Now I use Winsor & Newton can varnish for this. Now I used a gloss, and it turned out absolutely spectacular. I usually don't use a whole lot of gloss varnishes in the studio, but I think it really gave it a really great effect. Now just remember that because we do have the gold leaf in this overall painting here, sometimes you will see different lighting elements, gold, silvers, hitting this depending on how the light is, whether it's cool or warm. If you would like prints of this, I will be offering prints on Pictorum.com. You can always check that out. Just search my name, John Byerly, for any of the prints that I offer, whether it's photography or if it's actual paintings themselves. If you would like an original, make sure you reach out to me through Etsy or through my email at byerlystudios@gmail.com. Otherwise, you guys, I'm exceptionally happy with how this turned out. The next painting in the studio will be the painting of these foxes here, and I am almost midway through that process before we actually start in with the baby foxes as well as the mother fox. Super excited for that. That's supposed to be more so a representation of my family here in our house. Again, guys, I think this thing turned out absolutely phenomenal, and I'm really happy with the overall texture that I was able to achieve with the palette knife for this painting. Let me know in the description below how you think this painting turned out. I will catch you guys on the next awesome painting here in the studio. Peace!